Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Morality and Ethics Part 2. I trust that you have watched Part 1 and have learned something from it. And as covered previously, what we're going to be doing in this lecture series is we're going to be talking about a more practical application of the things that we learned in Part 1. So, to look at a quick recap of what we did cover in Part 1, just to jog your memory, we looked at a difference in definition between morals and ethics, where we said that morals are a more subjective view of what is right and wrong, and where ethics are more of a societal perception on what is the right thing to do. And then we looked at meta-ethics, which is moral realism versus moral anti-realism, basically believing that there are such things as objectively right and objectively wrong. And then we looked at four ethical theories: the divine command theory, which said that God commanded certain things which are right and wrong. We looked at the natural law theory, which said that God put into place certain goods, which we then derived positive and negative natural laws from. We looked at categorical imperatives and deontology. And finally, we looked at utilitarianism. Okay, so moving on from this recap to what we have to do today in this lecture, we're going to look at an overview. So we're going to be talking about utilitarianism, just explored a little further because we have already explained what it is, but we're going to look at some pros and cons to utilitarianism and how we can apply that in debating. Then we're going to look at a format for how to make a principled argument. And then finally, we're going to look at some common debating scenarios such as life debates and euthanasia, abortion, and torture. So starting with utilitarianism. So what we're going to talk about are the pros for utilitarianism. And then in the next slide, we're going to talk about the cons. The reason why we are giving you the pros and cons like this is that if you are ever making a case based on utilitarianism, you are aware of the various strengths and then shortcomings of that particular case. Conversely, if another team is setting up a utilitarian case, you are also aware of the various strengths and shortcomings of that case. This means that you are better placed to defend your case when necessary and better placed to know or identify what is wrong in the other team's case if necessary, right? So that's why we're giving it to you. So what are some of the pros of utilitarianism? Remember, we said that utilitarianism is essentially the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So what are the good things about this, right? Why is this a good ethical theory to use? Firstly, because happiness is something that is universal. What this means is that everyone knows what happiness feels like, and everyone feels it at least some of the time. Thus, we are not simply encoding some people's desires as being the things which matter, but we're working off a physical human good, something that we can all relate to. And the pursuit of happiness is something that guides all human action. The second reason why utilitarianism would be a good theory to use, rather, is that utilitarianism allows us to make trade-offs, right? So a rights-based or duty-based ethical theory, such as deontology, may leave us with unsolvable conflicts. So for example, when the right to life and the right to bodily autonomy conflict in the case of torturing a terrorist for potentially life-saving information, how are we then to decide which one is more important? Is it the right to life or is it the right to bodily autonomy? And that is sort of a difficult way up to make. And one of the pros of utilitarianism then is that, by contrast, utilitarianism is simply a matter of totting up the numbers. And this, at least in principle, gives us an answer, or allows us to reach an answer much easier. The third reason why utilitarianism is a good option is that it's a highly egalitarian doctrine, right? What this means is that it treats happiness as of equal worth, regardless of who possesses it. Moreover, because people who are worse off tend to gain more happiness from small incremental increases in their resources, utilitarianism may be regarded as redistributive, requiring us to give money to the poorest until each transfer does not make them happier than the corresponding loss of happiness for the rich, right? So basically what this is saying is that, in essence, if you had to really think about it, because we want the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and because we believe that pain is pain and pleasure is pleasure, we're able to make a way up and understand when someone is able to incrementally increase their happiness, right? And what we can do thereafter. But there's also some cons to utilitarianism. So what these cons would look like is that, number one, we can say that whilst we can all say that I am happy, We have no idea whether the good experienced is the same for all people or in fact radically different. And conceptions of what exactly happiness is a very inconsistent thing. Is happiness short-term pleasure or is happiness long-term satisfaction? That's something that we don't actually have an answer to. Secondly, why utilitarianism is maybe not the best way to go is that in theory it might allow for easy trade-offs, but in practice that's way more difficult to achieve because we do not know how to value happiness. So we do not know if everyone experiences it with the same intensity or whether some people can even get happier than others, right? We don't know how to measure it. And as such, it's not really useful in making real world choices. And that's something that I agree with as well. And then thirdly, utilitarianism imposes no limits whatsoever on what may be done to a person in pursuit of the greater good. So it erodes individual rights, and really no one would want to live in a world where it is possible for anything to be done to them by the state, for example, torture or murder, just at the cost of the greater good of people. So these were taken from a theory book in debating, which gave us like various pros and cons arguments. But again, it's just to help you conceptualize the idea of utilitarianism. And again, why is all of this important? Because it can be used to build arguments for and against a utilitarian model, and it can be used in rebuttal to critique a team's usage of utilitarianism. Again, it's not the most important thing in the world, but it's something that's nice to just have an idea of, and I just thought I'd rather include it in this presentation because there wasn't really enough time to do it in the previous presentation. Okay, now onto some very, very, very important stuff, right? So you really need to pay attention now. If you didn't care about whatever I said for this few 6 minutes thus far, now you need to start caring, right? So we're going to talk about how to make a principled argument, right? Looking at a structure for it. And this structure is borrowed from the South African World Schools Debating Handbook, that was made for this year, 2023, right? And it's a training manual. So there's a few steps that you take to make a principled argument. And again, it is useful to use these steps in order to make a principled argument, and you'll be able to see how it applies in an example thereafter, right? So what is the first step? Step one is identify the principle or right that is being discussed or that you want to argue for. For example, this can be choice. This can be freedom. This can be autonomy, so these are all ideas or principles, right? Step two is to provide a criteria or example to illustrate when this principle or right is upheld or when it ought not be upheld, right? This can be a general instance. This will make more sense when we do the example. The third step is to provide and explain an analogy or an example. Particularly when crafting principled arguments, the analogy is crucial because it allows the person who is seeing the principled argument to see the not practical, but see the real world value of it, right? And then step four is to explain why the principle is important. This is something that we tell you to do all the time. Explain why your rebuttal is important, explain why your argumentation is important. This is no different, right? And the important thing that I have to say is that remember, these arguments are often non-consequential. So whenever we make arguments, we can usually weigh them up on the basis of how they impact the people that we're talking about. Does it do something good for them? Does it do something bad for them, etc.? But with principled arguments, the way in which we need to value it is not necessarily on impact, but on is it the right thing to do or is it a good thing to do? And the criteria or the analogy or the example helps us understand whether we've done something principally consistent previously or whether we've done something principally inconsistent previously. And then we can make our way up or evaluation thereafter. So let's look at an example in the next slide. This house believes that sporting clubs should be held responsible for the actions of their fans. And we're going to be arguing from the position of the proposition. So we're going to use the very same framework that I just gave you. And using this framework, we're going to try and create a principled argument, a nice holistic principled argument to support why sporting clubs should be held responsible for the actions of their fans, right? And when we say actions of their fans, I'm sure everyone is aware of how we can take soccer, for example. Whenever there's soccer matches, there's often, especially broadly, internationally, right? There's often reports of situations where there's violence at the stadiums, etc., between the fans. It just gets a bit messy, right? So we want to hold sporting clubs responsible for that. Step one, identify the principle we want to argue for. So we're going to talk about the principle of responsibility or fairness. Why? Because the motion is this house believes that sporting clubs should be held responsible for the actions of their fans, right? So we're talking about responsibility or fairness. Step 2, remember we needed a criteria or example or general instance in which we apply the principle, right? So generally then, when do we hold someone responsible? For 3 reasons. Number 1, when they directly cause or contribute to the harm. Number 2, when they failed in their duty to prevent harm. And 3, when they benefit or profit from the harm. Now what you need to do is take that criteria or that example or general instance and apply it to the emotion that we're talking about. So using those 3 things, let's apply it to sports clubs. Is it true that sports clubs directly cause or contribute to the harm? We can say yes, because generally at these sporting matches, they sell a lot of cheap alcohol, and we know how people get, right, when they are drunk, etc. And this is something that does definitely contribute to violence, right? There is a direct cause between that. Secondly, the sports clubs generally take up a duty to protect their fans, and the people that are within these stadiums, and they try to protect them free from harm and free from abuse. And when they allow this to happen, they fail in their duty to keep people safe from abuse and violence. So they have failed in their duty. So that covers the second prong of the criteria. And thirdly, do these clubs then benefit or profit from the harm that comes to these fans? The answer then may be yes, because football clubs may even propagate toxic rivalries between teams to sell more merchandise or tickets, in which case they would benefit from the harm. So what we can see here is that it's quite evident that there's a criteria that we've identified and that we can apply this criteria to sporting clubs. So what's step 3 then? Step 3 is to give us another example or analogy to help ground the principle, to make it even more believable, So step 3, so for another example, wealthy executives are known to blatantly ignore human rights abuses during the production, sale, and consumption of goods. For example, in Shein. So basically the people that run Shein, we all know about the stories that occur with Shein, maybe even Amazon, the abuse of workers, etc., whilst the wealthy profit, right? So what we can say then is, for principled consistency, we would also hold these very executives of Shein, etc., liable because they are responsible for the harms caused to their workers or to the people. Similarly, what we are showing in this example is we're showing that when someone is directly responsible for something, we ought to hold them liable, and that is principally consistent, right? So that's all this example is doing. It's showing us that in times of principled consistency, we're going to stick with the principle no matter what, okay? And then step 4, showing me the importance of this, right? And why is responsibility important? Because justice should happen regardless of the outcome. We put people in jail not just because it stops crime, but because it's fair given that criminals are responsible for the harm that they cause. Right? So essentially, what we've created here is an entire argument irrespective of the outcome, irrespective of what's going to happen when we do hold these sporting clubs liable, right, for the actions of their fans. Irrespective of what happens, we believe it's their responsibility, Therefore, it's the fair thing to do to hold them liable for the actions against their fans. So hopefully you have a bit of an idea of how to structure a principled argument, right? So now what we're going to look at is some more principles to think about. So we're going to look at some more practical applications. And these practical applications aren't done in the full structure that I just spoke about, but I'm doing that intentionally so that it can be up to you to see if you can apply the structure. What I'm going to be giving you is some various considerations and maybe things to provoke some thought, to think about what's going on with these various principles, to see if you can identify the principle, if you agree with the argument, if you disagree with it. Remember, these arguments may be right or they may be wrong. You may, when hearing me speak about it, you may hear or you may think of a rebuttal to it. Hold on to that, right? Because that may be completely valid, right? That's the whole point of this particular exercise, right? So we are going to think about what the things to follow. So the first thing we're going to look at is the idea of life debates and euthanasia, right? And a motion that I just a nonsense motion just to give you is, this house supports physician-assisted euthanasia for terminally ill patients. Basically, just to quickly explain, physicians are doctors, right? Euthanasia is a process where a doctor is able to end the life of a patient with the consent of the patient or the family members, because the patient is going to die anyway, right? They have some end stage disease where they're not going to live much longer, and to be put out of their misery, the patient wants to be their life would consensually their life wants to be terminated, right? That's fine. So we are supporting this. So let's look at what someone on prop could say, right? So someone on prop could talk about autonomy, right? And just as a person has the right to determine the course of his or her life, a person also has the right to determine the course of his or her own dying, right? So if a person seeks assistance in suicide from a physician freely and rationally, the physician ought to be permitted to provide it, you know. Respect for autonomy requires allowing rational self-governance and should only be limited to the degree to which it causes harm to others. So what we're saying here is that if we allow people to make autonomous choices in life, we should allow them to make autonomous choices in death, as long as they aren't harming others. And that's an interesting consideration, you know. And then op can then come up and say, but is it really true autonomy? You know, is true autonomy possible for someone who is dying or at that stage? You know, because not only are most choices socially formed, but the effects of terminal illness, the psychological, the physical effects, are coercive in nature, right? Meaning that they can persuade you to want to make this decision, right? And moreover, the nature of death is completely unknown. And without adequate information, one cannot meaningfully consent to assisted suicide, right? Or this euthanasia. So what that means is that we ought to know that when building a choice argument, one of the prongs or important parts of that is that that choice ought to be informed. But what we're saying here on op is that if we don't really know much about death, then we aren't really informed about it. So if you aren't really informed about it, how can you make an autonomous choice about it, you know? And what this then means, and what we want to identify from this, is that noting that prop is arguing a deontological principle, you know, in favor of autonomy, you know, the principle of autonomy, the right for the individual person. But op is also arguing within the deontological principle. But op is saying that this motion doesn't fulfill the moral good that prop intends to do. So prop is saying, hey, autonomy is a moral good. We should promote things that allow autonomy. But op is saying, you know what, you may be right. You know, maybe it is true that we should promote things that allow for autonomy of people, but this isn't a true situation to get autonomy. So I hope we understand the difference, right? So it's not always going to be deontology versus utilitarianism. Sometimes both sides of the debate may be arguing for deontology, but it's about whether that principle is the correct principle, whether it can actually occur, and whether it's correctly placed. So looking at the same debate again, right, about the life debate in euthanasia, there's even more arguments for it, right? So another argument on prop can be that killing can be morally permissible in the sense that it is a form of self-defense. So, proponents of euthanasia point out that there are some circumstances in which killing is morally permissible, such as war and self-defense. Thus, killing for a good reason may be acceptable. Moreover, one could consider euthanasia a form of self-defense. If someone was causing suffering, indignity, and was going to kill you, most people would deem it morally acceptable to kill your killer. And one can therefore choose to defend themselves against something, which is the illness, rather than someone. So what that's basically saying is that essentially, if you look at this illness that the person has that's taking their life, this illness is going to kill the person anyway, you know, and it's something that's attacking you. It's attacking against your own physical body. And it is almost a form of self-defense to want to act in opposition to that very thing, you know, and that's sort of interesting as well. So in that sense, the very killing of this patient by the doctor consensually is something that could be morally permissible because it's an act of self-defense, you know. And then furthermore, on op, then what op would say is that okay, but if we allow this action, we may increase the callous treatment of patients and undermine the trust between the doctor and the patient. Because doctors would then be less willing to perform risky procedures if the patient could simply opt out, and that would just not reflect badly on their medical records, you know. And moreover, governments and society are unlikely to invest in palliative care if the option of physician assisted suicide is normalized, right? So palliative care, by the way, is just care for people who are at the end of their lives, right? And it's trying to make their lives better, right? Rather than cure them because they can't be cured at that point in time. So yeah, that's also another interesting thing to look at. And what we can see is that there's shades of moral anti-realism that come through on prop. They say that although people believe that killing is objectively bad, remember moral anti-realism, there's no objective fact. So they say that although people may believe that killing is objectively bad, it should depend on the circumstance, because in this case, because it's self-defense, it may be actually good. And ops response, which is the long-term effects, is actually a point of utilitarianism. Remember, rule utilitarianism. So if you remember from the part 1 video, you would recall how we said that rule utilitarians are interested in the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the long term. So when we're considering the long-term effects for the most amount of people, we are arguing from the point of rule utilitarianism, and that's what op is saying here. Okay, so next we can look at the idea of abortion, right? And the motion, simply this house supports abortion, right? And of course, the abortion debate has become a more complex issue than just this, but this is just for the purpose of the argumentation, right? So what can we say on prop, right? Prop can say an unborn fetus does not meet the criteria for personhood, right? So in order to understand the moral status of a fetus, we must understand how personhood is defined. So John Locke, this guy here, is an English philosopher who defined personhood as an intelligent being with reason and reflection that has consciousness. And Locke suggests that the capacity for self-consciousness, coupled with the minimum intelligence, is necessary for moral agency, but also a minimum condition for any deliberate behavior. More importantly, these capacities, right, allow humans to value their own existence and that of others. The wrong done to an individual in this case is the wrong of depriving that individual of something that they value, right? So basically it's saying is that the idea of personhood is that we are able to have deliberate behaviors and consciousness and value certain things around us. And then what the argument says is that failing to sustain the life of a non-person, or in other words, the unborn fetus, does that individual no real harm because it cannot deprive them of something that they value. So it's to say that an unborn fetus is unable to determine consciously what they can value. And because of that, we are not really able to deprive them of something that they can value. Therefore, it isn't really a conversation about their personhood, because they don't really have personhood, is what this argument is saying. And looking at whether an individual has moral worth, is a deontological perspective, and I hope you picked that up. And then op then shows us the problem with arguing what prop has just said, which is that so the criteria for personhood, right, is any self-conscious, minimally intelligent being, right? So they have to be self-conscious, they have to be minimally intelligent, they have to be able to gather value in various things. However, for personhood status to hold, we also need detectable evidence of personhood. So personhood applied to human individuals implies that the life cycle of a given individual passes through several stages of different moral significance. So the individual exists before it acquires personhood. But the problem is now that this Locke's criteria, right, for personhood also makes infanticide permissible, which is the killing of just newborn babies, right? Since there's very little difference between a newborn baby and an unborn fetus, right, in terms of their ability to be conscious and have things that they value, right? So in that case, if they don't have consciousness and they don't have things that they can value, then we could also just kill them. What stops us from killing them? And that's the problem with this personhood argument, And moreover, this criteria may also put severely mentally handicapped adults at risk of being defined as non-persons, because they could have mental retardation to the point at which they don't have self-consciousness, and they may have rudimentary intelligence. And those in a permanent vegetative state will have no personhood by this definition also. So what we've identified on op is why this definition of personhood is something that's a problem. Okay. But further looking at abortion is some other considerations, and prop talking about the fact that this could be an immoral act, right? So what are they saying? So the life of a child that is not wanted by their mother is likely to have many challenges, whether they remain with the mother or not. It can be established that bringing a child into an environment that on the balance of probabilities is likely to contain more pain than pleasure is an immoral act, right? And that's the concept of utilitarianism applied. In other words, the overall consequence is negative. And this is a sad thing that we know about, right? We know that sometimes in certain cases children aren't wanted, and if you're brought into the world in a situation where it is very likely that you are not going to be cared for. The kind of utility in that world is very low. There's going to be a lot more pain than pleasure in that kind of world that baby is brought into. And on a utilitarian perspective, we would be harming them a lot if we were bringing them into the world. So you understand that difference, right? And then looking at op, right, is there was this guy called Don Marquis, right? So there's an interesting quote by him on the left there, right? There is nothing we are to see so much as the gleam of pleasure in a person's eyes when he feels that we have sympathized with him, understood him. At these moments, something fine and spiritual passes between two friends. These are the moments worth living. Quite a nice quote, right? But anyway, the op argument, what Don Marquis says is that what is wrong with killing adult human beings is that we deprive them of a future or a life like ours. The harm done is not just that we go against their desire to keep living, but that we deprive them of the possibilities of the future formation of new desires and preferences. So what it's saying is that we don't just, by killing someone, we don't just harm their ability to live now, but we harm their ability to make decisions and have desires in future, And this argument makes a moral claim independent of whether the individual has the preference to go on living and of what species you are, If you have a future sufficiently like the one we have, the argument stands. Because if you deprive them of that future sufficiently like ours, the argument stands. So therefore, by that logic, the fetus does already have a future like ours, if you think about it, right? No more logically uncertain or contingent than the life of any other. And it is on that basis that it's deemed immoral to kill it. Because by killing this fetus or unborn fetus, we are depriving them of a future just like ours, And the problem, though, however, with this argument is of how arbitrary the stipulation of a future like mine is. What even is a future like ours? Because aliens could have a very different future from ours, but our treatment of them would still be something that is morally important and critiqued and valued, right? So that's looking at the idea of abortion and some prop and op arguments. The next and final thing we're going to look at is torture, right? So to basically explain the scenario, which is something very common in debating, and if you haven't heard it by now, this is the time you're going to hear it. It's that there's a scenario we have where we have captured a terrorist or an alleged terrorist, and we now have the ability to torture them to find out information about a bomb being detonated. Did I say bomb? Bomb, right? Being detonated, potentially protecting many people, right? That's basically the situation. The terrorist is like, right, I've planted a bomb here in this building. It's going to kill so many people if it's detonated. And then you're going to torture this terrorist to retrieve information. So the prop argument is something that every debater should be able to come up with, right? It's the most basic, almost the most boring argument that comes up. It's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So basically what that says is that, and then op says that we treat terrorists as a means to an end. So I'm not going to go over the prop argument, right? Because everyone knows that, right? If we harm this terrorist, it's fine because we may save 500 people, simple. But the op is where it gets a bit more interesting, right? So what op says is that we treat terrorists as a means to an end, and that's bad. So the categorical opposition for torture, meaning the deontological opposition, right, is that torture treats victims as a means to an end and not an end in and of themselves. And victims of torture are treated as things to be manipulated through pain and dehumanization to obtain a torturer's desired aims. To torture an individual is to treat them without any human value, simply as something to break. This directly violates people's rights and their human dignity. It is fundamentally unjust for a state to sanction a policy that does this, especially where there are alternatives. The justification for the use of torture is typically about the severity of harms that could be prevented with its use. In using torture, however, we become the very type of evil thing that we are trying to prevent. So that's the deontological perspective. I'm sure you will remember the categorical imperative with Immanuel Kant, where he told us that people should be treated as not a mere means to an end, but they are ends in and of themselves. But furthermore, so it's the same scenario. What about, so that is the categorical or the deontological opposition to torture. What about, because we said that prop is a utilitarian. Okay, so if prop is a utilitarian, what if we could create an argument that is utilitarian but an op, right? And there is one, right? So the consequentialist opposition for torture is significant. Number one, we can say that torture is an ineffective interrogation tool because the victim will ultimately say anything to stop the pain, regardless of whether it's the truth or not. And due to this, the interrogator will never know what the victim is actually telling them, or whether what they're actually telling them is the truth, and the torturer will never know when to stop. So if a suspect volunteers information under torture, it is impossible to prosecute them as well, right? And common law typically excludes involuntary statements or confessions, as such information is inherently unreliable, and this means that torture comes at the opportunity cost of subsequently trying the individual and following due process to achieve justice. And this argument then shows us how we may not achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people, because it says that what if we're just doing this for nothing? It could just be for nothing, and then we're not really helping the greatest number of people. Furthermore, we could also say that torture is almost always outside of normal state functions, right? That's something that we know, and practices, and it's therefore also outside the normal framework of establishing someone as guilty or innocent. And that means that typically an abnormally large proportion of torture victims are either innocent or of mistaken identity. And the next thing is that we can say that torture damages the moral authority and integrity of the institution that's carrying it out, And if an institution is not concerned about what actions are justified or not, they degrade the rule of law and fairness as central pillars of their justice system. If you're willing to torture someone for a good reason, it just makes it that much easier to torture them for a bad reason. And this is another deontological principle, and it brings into question the intent of the actor carrying out the torture. That is why it's deontological, because we're looking at whether they are acting from a good position, right? And however, this could also be viewed as utilitarian, because it brings into question the consequence of not acting with moral integrity. So it just shows us that things may not be black and white, that there's a variation in everything, variation in all these ethical theories. All right, so now we've come to the take-home message, right? Half an hour later. And everything that I've spoken about are merely examples of how ethical theories can be applied to create arguments and respond to other arguments. We can utilize similar logic when applying ethical theories. And you can also use some of the arguments seen in future, right? The argument in favor of personhood, or questioning whether autonomy actually exists, or the morality of an act. These can be applied in a variety of debates. However, don't just quote the argument that I've given you. Take the structure of a principal argument that I gave you earlier on and try and apply these ideas to it. Anytime you have an idea that is a principled idea, you should be able to extract what is necessary and apply it to that formula. And then I'm sure your principled arguments are going to become much more compelling. Okay, so these are some of the references for this talk. And thank you very much, right? I hope you've learned a lot throughout this process. And that concludes morality and ethics for now. Go forth and evaluate.